wrought iron gates of the Ellington estate stood tall and unmoving, wrapped in ivy and memory. As the black luxury sedan crept up the mile-long gravel driveway, a soft crunch echoed beneath the wheels, an echo that hadn't been heard in years. Inside the car, Thomas Ellington leaned back in his leather seat, the Virginia countryside blurring past the window. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the armrest, knuckles white. The sight of his childhood home, a sprawling southern estate that had stood for over a century, stirred something deep in his chest. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was responsibility, legacy, and maybe dread. Beside him sat Vanessa, his wife of just 7 months, elegant, polished, and always poised. She wore a designer silk blouse and a muted shade of ivory, her manicured fingers gently tapping against her phone screen. She hadn't looked up once since they'd passed the front gates. Thomas glanced at her, catching the slight downturn of her lips. He knew that look. She'd envisioned something else, something sleek and modern, not a house draped in history, oak, and mahogany. "You okay?" he asked. Vanessa lifted her eyes from the phone for the first time. "It's charming," she said, offering a practiced smile, like something out of a documentary. Thomas chuckled under his breath, not sure whether to take it as a compliment or critique. With Vanessa, it was often both. As the car came to a slow stop in front of the grand stone staircase, a small team of household staff waited in a neat line, just like they used to when he was a boy returning home from school. But Thomas wasn't a boy anymore, and he wasn't coming home to be cared for. He was returning as a man who'd built an empire, a name that reached far beyond the old southern roots of the Ellington family name. He stepped out first, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the white columns and wide veranda. He adjusted the collar of his blazer and turned back to help Vanessa from the car. She stepped out gracefully, her heels clicking sharply against the brick drive. Her gaze swept across the staff, pausing briefly, just long enough to take them in, but not long enough to connect. Then her eyes moved to the house itself, the tall windows, the wraparound porch, the aged shutters and the massive wooden doors that hadn't changed since Thomas was 10 years old. "I was expecting something a little more updated," she murmured. Before Thomas could reply, the double doors opened. Out stepped Aunt Eleanor, regal in her posture, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. A sharp woman with a sharper tongue, she'd been the de facto matriarch since Thomas's parents passed. Right behind her was Calvin, Thomas's older brother, tall, smug, and impossible to read. "Look what the wind blew in," Calvin grinned. "The prodigal son with a brand new accessory." Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He gave a quick nod, then turned to Eleanor. "Aunt Ellie," he said warmly. Eleanor nodded, eyeing Vanessa with the calm scrutiny of someone who'd met enough polished strangers to know which ones were real. "And this must be your wife," she said. "Vanessa, isn't it?" Vanessa offered her hand with the perfect society smile. "A pleasure. I've heard so much about you." "I'm sure," Eleanor replied evenly. Then just beyond the others, standing back, half shadowed by the porch beam, he saw her, Miss Loretta. Her back was straighter than he remembered, and though her hair was now silver instead of black, her presence was the same, calm, rooted, unshakable. She wore a simple navy uniform, her hands clasped in front of her dark skin lined by time and wisdom. Thomas stepped past his brother, past his aunt, past the awkward silence between his new bride and the old guard, and walked straight toward her. "Miss Loretta." Her face lit up instantly. "My boy," she said, her voice thick with warmth. "You're home." He pulled her into a hug without hesitation. She smelled of lavender in the past, of safety, of scraped knees and bedtime stories. Vanessa stood frozen, watching. She had never seen Thomas hug anyone like that, and she had no idea who this woman really was. But she would soon, very soon. As he embraced Miss Loretta, the years seemed to peel away like paint from weathered wood. He was no longer the sharply dressed businessman with $1 million watch. He was that skinny, wide-eyed boy again, clinging to the one person in the world who'd never let him fall. She patted his back gently, the way she used to when he'd wake up crying from a nightmare, or scrape his knee chasing fireflies out back. Her hands were older now, the skin thinner, but the strength in her touch remained unchanged. When they finally pulled apart, she looked up at him and smiled. "You've gotten taller, but your eyes are still the same," she said, full of questions. Thomas chuckled. "You always said I asked too many. That's because you wanted answers grown-ups didn't know how to give," she replied, her voice steady, like a slow southern breeze. Vanessa approached then, her heels clicking across the stone. Her expression was smooth, unreadable, the way Thomas had seen her greet hotel managers or gallery curators. Polite, distant. He turned toward her. "Vanessa, this is Miss Loretta. She raised me." Miss Loretta extended a hand with a kind smile. "It's a pleasure, ma'am." Vanessa hesitated just long enough for it to be noticeable, then lightly took Loretta's hand in hers, giving it the kind of half-hearted shake one might offer a sales clerk. "Nice to meet you," she said. Her tone was pleasant, but her gaze had already shifted elsewhere. Miss Loretta's smile never faltered, but Thomas noticed the slight dip in her shoulders, just a fraction of an inch, just enough to be felt by anyone paying attention. "She practically raised you?" Vanessa asked once they were inside, walking through the grand foyer. Her tone was airy, but there was an edge under it, like a knife concealed in silk. "She did more than that," Thomas said, running his hand along the banister. "She held this place together when no one else could. When my parents were off chasing God knows what, Loretta was the one making sure we had clean clothes, food on the table, and someone to say goodnight." Vanessa paused beside an antique mirror. "And she still lives here?" "Yes. Her quarters are just off the east wing, where they've always been." There was a long pause before Vanessa replied. "I see." They didn't speak again until dinner. The family gathered around the long oak dining table. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow over silver place settings and fine china. Vanessa took in the surroundings with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Loretta moved through the room with practiced grace, ensuring each guest was served, each dish placed perfectly. But this time, Vanessa's eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Thomas saw it, the way his wife's gaze lingered a beat too long, the way her lips pursed when Loretta quietly corrected a server's mistake. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The air was shifting, and for the first time since coming home, Thomas felt a tension he couldn't quite name. Miss Loretta caught his eye from across the room, offering a small, reassuring nod, as if to say, "I'm fine. This isn't the first time I've been looked at like that." But that was the problem. It shouldn't have happened once, let alone again. And deep down, Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The following morning brought a soft, golden light through the tall windows of the Ellington estate. Birds sang lazily outside, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the halls. The calm of morning didn't reach Vanessa, though. She sat at the breakfast table in a pale silk robe, flipping through a design magazine while Thomas sipped from a heavy ceramic mug. "Have you thought any more about renovating the dining room?" she asked, not looking up. "It could really use a refresh." Thomas glanced around. "My family's eaten in that room for over 100 years. I kind of like the way it is." Vanessa shrugged. "I just think some things could use a little modernizing." Before Thomas could reply, the door opened and Miss Loretta entered, carrying a silver tray with fresh fruit and toast. She moved gracefully, setting everything in its place with practiced care. "Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said with a soft smile. "Morning, Loretta," Thomas replied. Vanessa gave a cursory glance and nodded. "Morning." Loretta turned to leave, but before she could step away, Vanessa spoke again. "Oh, Loretta," she said, her tone airy, almost sing-song. "Could you be a dear and polish the silver in the dining room? It looked a bit dull last night." Thomas looked up from his coffee. "Loretta's not housekeeping. She manages the staff." Vanessa gave him a quick smile. "Of course, but I thought since she's so familiar with the family's preferences, she'd want to keep things looking just right." Miss Loretta didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am. I'll see to it." She turned and left the room, her footsteps quiet on the hardwood floors. Thomas frowned. "She's not a maid, Vanessa." "I didn't say she was," Vanessa replied, flipping the page in her magazine. "But if she's living here, part of the staff, isn't that her role? I don't see what the big deal is." "It's not what she does. It's who she is," he said, setting his mug down. "Loretta raised me. She held this house together long before you or I ever had a say." Vanessa's smile thinned slightly. "That's sweet, but that was then. This is now." Later that day, as they toured the house together, Vanessa paused by the family portraits lining the main hallway. She looked up at the oil paintings of Thomas's ancestors, men in suits and women in long gowns, all stern-faced and proud. "Very traditional," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you ever think about rotating some of these out? Maybe putting up something more contemporary?" Thomas raised a brow. "These are my grandparents, great-grandparents. Some of them helped build this place." Vanessa touched one of the frames lightly. "And I'm sure they were very important. But sometimes it's okay to leave the past behind." That evening, the staff gathered in the kitchen for their dinner, a long-standing practice Miss Loretta had preserved for decades. Thomas stopped by on his way upstairs and saw her seated with the cooks and groundskeepers, laughing softly over a story someone was telling. He smiled to himself, but just as he turned to leave, he heard Vanessa's voice from behind him. "They dine in the main house?" He turned. "They always have." She raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Where I grew up, staff ate separately." Thomas paused. "This isn't where you grew up." Her lips curved into something that looked like a smile, but felt more like a challenge. "No, it isn't." And in that moment, Thomas realized that Vanessa didn't just see Miss Loretta as someone beneath her. She saw the entire world of this house, this legacy, as something to be restructured around her own image. And that included rewriting the place of the woman who had once been the only warmth in his childhood. The dining room was radiant that evening. Candlelight flickered along the length of the polished mahogany table, reflecting off delicate crystal and fine-bone china. The Ellington family had gathered in full, Aunt Eleanor seated at the head, Calvin on one side, Thomas and Vanessa on the other. A few family friends were visiting from out of state, adding a thin layer of formality to the evening. Vanessa was glowing. Draped in a deep burgundy gown and adorned in diamond earrings, she played the perfect hostess, laughing lightly at jokes, offering compliments with practiced ease. From a distance, no one could tell anything was amiss. Miss Loretta moved quietly through the room, as she had for over 40 years, refilling glasses, checking plates, making sure everything was perfect. She had always refused to sit out formal dinners, not because she didn't deserve a place, but because she believed in service. It was her way of honoring the home. But Vanessa didn't see tradition. She saw something else entirely. As Miss Loretta leaned forward to refill Vanessa's glass of red wine, the moment unfolded with subtle precision. Vanessa shifted her arm with sudden flourish, as if turning to gesture at something across the table. Her elbow bumped the base of the wine glass, just enough to tip it forward. The crimson liquid spilled instantly, arching through the air like a dark ribbon before splashing across Miss Loretta's uniform. The room fell silent. Forks paused. Glasses were suspended midair. Aunt Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Thomas's jaw tensed. "Oh!" Vanessa gasped, placing a delicate hand over her mouth. "I'm so sorry. How terribly clumsy of me." Miss Loretta glanced down at the spreading stain across her navy blouse. Slowly, she set the decanter aside and reached for a linen napkin. "It's quite all right, ma'am," she said calmly. Her voice didn't waver, but Thomas heard it, the breath she didn't take, the emotion she swallowed. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, dabbing at her mouth with her own napkin, as if nothing had happened. "I guess I got a little too animated," she said with a soft laugh, eyes glancing around the table for sympathy. None came. Aunt Eleanor set her wine glass down with a sharp clink. "Funny, I've never seen you animated enough to throw wine before." Vanessa offered her a gracious smile. "Accidents happen." Thomas's voice was low. "Loretta, do you want to step out and change?" Miss Loretta shook her head gently. "No, sir. I'm fine." She excused herself anyway, walking with quiet dignity out of the room, her back straight, her stained blouse glowing in the candlelight like a wound. The moment she left, the tension in the room cracked open. Thomas turned to Vanessa. "What the hell was that?" Vanessa blinked. "Are you seriously suggesting that was intentional?" "You tell me." "I don't need to tell you anything," she replied, lifting her glass again. "If you think I'd waste vintage Bordeaux on making a statement, you clearly don't know me." Across the table, Calvin let out a sharp breath, then shook his head. "Actually, that might be the first honest thing you've said since you got here." Vanessa's expression tightened, but she said nothing more. Thomas didn't eat another bite that evening. The roast was tender, the potatoes creamy, but everything tasted like ashes in his mouth. And later, when he walked past Miss Loretta's quarters, he saw a small bundle of laundry hanging to dry. The burgundy stain had already begun to fade, but what it left behind wouldn't wash out so easily. 2 days had passed since the spill, but the tension lingered, thick and unspoken, like the Virginia humidity before a thunderstorm. Vanessa had resumed her usual elegance, hosting tea on the veranda, meeting with decorators, and charming the estate's guests with stories of her life in D.C. But Thomas could tell something was shifting. Her observations were becoming more pointed, her suggestions more strategic. It started with an afternoon conversation over coffee in the library. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said, her voice soft but deliberate, "if we're serious about modernizing the estate, we should take a look at the staff quarters." Thomas lowered his newspaper. "What about them?" "They're very close to the main wing. Practically attached, actually. That might have made sense decades ago, but nowadays, privacy is important. For everyone." He gave her a look. "They've always lived there, Vanessa. Loretta's been in that suite since I was in kindergarten." She smiled gently. "Exactly. It's time for change. We could convert those rooms into guest suites, make the house more functional. The staff could be moved to the outer building near the stables. It's still on the property." Thomas studied her. "This isn't about function. It's about Loretta." She didn't deny it. "Thomas, she's in everything. Every room, every hallway. She hovers. It's uncomfortable. She's part of this house." "She's part of your past," Vanessa replied, a little sharper than intended. "But this is our future, and honestly, her presence makes it hard for me to feel like this is my home." There it was, clear as day. Thomas set down his cup, his voice calm but edged. "You knew who Loretta was before you married me. I didn't hide that. I didn't realize she still had this much influence. She's family." Vanessa's lips twitched into a polite smile. "She's staff." The words landed like a slap. That evening, she brought it up again, this time at dinner, with Aunt Eleanor and Calvin present. Her tone was casual, but her message unmistakable. "I've asked a contractor to come by next week," she said over roasted chicken and wild rice, "just to take a look at the East Wing. Maybe we can redesign those rooms into something more functional." Aunt Eleanor lowered her fork. "That wing, dear, is where Loretta lives." Vanessa dabbed her mouth with her napkin. "Of course, but she might be more comfortable in the outer quarters. Closer to the garden, more natural light." Thomas looked up. "She didn't ask for that." "Well," Vanessa replied with a serene smile, "sometimes people don't know what's best for them until they're given the option." Calvin scoffed. "You're not giving her an option. You're giving her the door." Vanessa's smile didn't waver. "I'm simply trying to bring this house into the 21st century." "No," Aunt Eleanor said, her voice like flint. "You're trying to erase the one person in this house who knows where every buried bone is, and who buried it." The table fell quiet. Vanessa raised her glass. "Change is never comfortable, is it?" Thomas didn't touch his food. The silverware felt heavy in his hands. Across the table, Loretta said nothing. She just stood in the doorway, having overheard enough. She met Thomas's eyes, and in hers he saw not hurt, but something worse: resignation. The next morning, Thomas found himself in his father's old study, the place he always went when his mind was too full. The smell of old books, leather-bound volumes, and pipe tobacco lingered in the air, grounding him. But even in that quiet, the voices from the night before echoed loudly. He hadn't seen Loretta all morning. There was a knock at the door, soft but firm. Aunt Eleanor stepped inside, her gray shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her expression unreadable. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Of course." She walked in and shut the door behind her. For a moment, she just looked at him, really looked at him. Her sharp blue eyes, the same ones that used to scare off reporters and real estate developers alike, now filled with concern. "Thomas," she said slowly, "do you know what your wife is doing?" He sighed. "She has ideas, opinions." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Ideas? That woman is drawing blueprints to erase the very heart of this home." "She's not trying to erase anything," he said, though the words felt thinner every time he said them. "She wants Loretta out of the house," Eleanor snapped. "You heard her, and you sat there, silent." Thomas ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "It's more complicated than that." "No, it's really not," she replied. "Loretta gave this family her entire life. She buried your mother. She nursed your father through his final days. And you," her voice softened just slightly, "you were her baby. When your parents were off in Europe chasing nonsense, Loretta was the one who read you bedtime stories, taught you how to tie your shoes, and stood outside your classroom door during every parent-teacher conference." "I know," Thomas said, his voice low. "You think I don't know that? Then why are you letting that woman dismantle this place one tradition at a time?" she asked. "This isn't just about paint colors and floor plans. This is about who gets to belong in this house." There was a pause, then a second knock. Calvin poked his head in. "Are we interrupting, or is this the intervention I was promised?" Thomas gave him a look. "What do you want, Cal?" "To say the thing you're too proud to hear," Calvin said, stepping inside. "Vanessa doesn't want Loretta gone because she dislikes her uniform or her room placement. She wants her gone because she can't stand a black woman walking around here with the kind of respect money can't buy." The words hit like a punch. Thomas stiffened. "Don't look so surprised," Calvin added. "You've seen it. You've heard the tone. The way she talks to her, looks at her, like she's furniture with opinions. I married her because I thought she understood my life," Thomas said quietly. "No," Eleanor replied. "You married her because you thought she'd understand your future, but she doesn't give a damn about your past. And Loretta is your past. She's the only part of it that still breathes. Thomas leaned back in the chair, staring up at the high wooden beams of the study ceiling. The silence pressed down on all of them. Finally, Eleanor said, "If you don't stand up now, Thomas, you're going to wake up one day and find the best parts of this house, of yourself, gone." She stood and walked out without another word. Calvin followed, but not before pausing at the door. "If she goes, I go too. Just so you know." The door clicked shut, and Thomas was alone again, with nothing but the truth he could no longer avoid. The grand ballroom of the Ellington estate hadn't seen this kind of glamour in years. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm golden light, casting reflections on polished floors. Classical music floated in the air, and guests in tailored suits and silk gowns mingled beneath sweeping arches. It was Vanessa's idea, a formal reception to introduce the new lady of the house to the broader social circle. To the outside world, it was elegance, grace, a family rooted in legacy and looking toward the future. But to Thomas, it felt like theater. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, answering polite questions about his firm's latest acquisition. But all the while, his eyes scanned the room for one person. And then he saw her, Miss Loretta. She wasn't dressed for the occasion. She never would have accepted a place on the guest list. But she had been asked to assist behind the scenes, overseeing staff, making sure things ran smoothly, as she had for every major family event since Thomas could remember. She moved with quiet grace, her head high, her black skirt modest and neat, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched a young server nervously balance a tray of champagne. But across the room, Vanessa was watching her too. Thomas had seen that look before, at the breakfast table, by the portraits, in the dining room. It was the gaze of someone measuring, not if, but when they'd erase something they didn't understand. As Thomas made his way toward Loretta, he overheard it. He didn't catch the beginning, just a burst of soft laughter from Vanessa's circle, but the tone was unmistakable. "Oh, come on," Vanessa said, her voice sweet but slicing. "I'm just saying it's 2025. There are agencies for that kind of help now." The guests chuckled uneasily. One woman tilted her head. "You mean Loretta?" Vanessa sipped from her glass. "I mean, really, a live-in housekeeper from another century who acts like family. It's a bit precious." Thomas froze. Across the room, Loretta had paused near the edge of the entryway. Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. The laughter wasn't cruel, it wasn't loud, but it was public, deliberate. And for the first time, the woman who had stood through storms and funerals, who had weathered generations of Ellington drama without flinching, was humiliated in her own home. Thomas moved before he even realized it, crossing the floor in long, deliberate strides. The group turned as he approached. Vanessa's smile didn't waver, though her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Darling," she said smoothly, "we were just talking about traditions." "Stop," Thomas said. The room fell quiet. He turned to the others. "Excuse us." With a hand gently placed at Vanessa's elbow, he guided her away from the circle, toward a quiet corner near the base of the grand staircase. Her smile finally slipped. "Thomas, what on earth? That woman raised me," he said, his voice low and firm. "And you just mocked her like she was some relic, like she was an embarrassment." "It was a joke," Vanessa said tightly. "No," he snapped. "It was cruelty wrapped in charm, and you knew it." She stared at him. "Are you really going to make a scene over her?" "Yes, I should have made a scene weeks ago." He looked toward Loretta, who had already turned and quietly walked back toward the kitchen, her dignity still intact, but just barely. "I've stood by long enough," he said, "but tonight, That was the last straw. Vanessa crossed her arms. What are you going to do? Thomas looked at her with a gaze she'd never seen before. Something I should have done a long time ago. The party faded into the background that night, but the weight of everything that had been said lingered in the walls of the Ellington estate like smoke after a fire. Thomas didn't sleep. The formal wear lay tossed on the edge of a velvet chaise. He stood by the bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit garden below, his mind replaying every moment of the evening. The laughter, Vanessa's words, and Loretta's face as she quietly slipped away into the shadows. He should have gone after her right then, but he didn't. And by morning, the house already felt different. The scent of her lavender soap no longer floated down the second-floor hallway. Her soft footsteps were missing from the rhythm of the day. And when Thomas passed the kitchen, it was too quiet. Something had left, and everyone could feel it. Aunt Eleanor found him in the hallway by mid-morning. "She's gone," she said flatly, arms folded, lips pursed. Thomas turned sharply. "What do you mean, gone?" "She packed a small bag, left before sunrise, didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye." Thomas felt the words hit like a punch to the chest. She didn't need to," Eleanor cut in. "You know exactly why she left." He didn't answer. She stepped closer, her voice softer now, but no less direct. "You saw her hurt. You saw her dignity stripped piece by piece, and you let it happen, not just last night, but for weeks. Do you think silence doesn't speak?" Later that day, he went to her quarters. The door stood open, but the room was empty, clean, bare. Her quilt, hand-stitched with squares of memory, was gone. The photo of his 5th birthday, the one where he clung to her leg with cake on his face, no longer sat on the nightstand. Even her Bible was missing from the shelf. Only the faint scent of lavender remained, like a whisper of who she'd been in this home. Thomas sat down on the neatly made bed, elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. He had defended her too late. In the days that followed, the estate continued to run, but it limped without her. The staff, though professional, moved quietly, cautiously. The air was heavier now, even in rooms filled with fresh flowers and sunshine. Vanessa didn't say much about Loretta's departure. A brief, "Well, I suppose she needed a break," was all she offered. But Thomas noticed the way she seemed relieved, the way her heels clicked more confidently through the halls, the way her suggestions grew bolder, new paint swatches, furniture catalogs, renovation proposals. It was like she thought the house could be molded now, shaped into something sleek and unburdened by the past. But she was wrong, because Thomas could feel the void, not just the absence of a caretaker, but the loss of a constant, a pillar in his life since before he even knew what the word family meant. One evening, after another strained dinner, he walked alone into the garden. The roses were blooming, the hydrangeas glowed pale blue under the fading sky, and beneath the sycamore tree, where Loretta used to sit with her tea and knit during quiet afternoons, the bench was empty. He sat down, the air heavy on his chest. "I let you down," he whispered to the breeze, his voice cracking. A silence followed, broken only by the rustle of leaves. He didn't know where she had gone, but he knew this much. He was going to find her, and this time he wouldn't be silent. It took Thomas 2 days to find her. She hadn't gone far, just 45 minutes outside Richmond, to a quiet little town where the sidewalks cracked under age and porches leaned into the wind. She was staying with her sister, Miss Helen, in a modest brick home nestled beneath a canopy of aging oak trees. Thomas stood at the curb for a long time before walking up the steps. He felt out of place in his blazer and polished shoes, carrying nothing but the weight of his silence. He knocked twice. The door creaked open. Miss Helen peered out through the screen door. She was shorter than Loretta, a little rounder, with the same sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air that made Thomas feel like he was 15 again. You've got a lot of nerve coming here, Thomas Ellington. I know, he said quietly. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. She's out back. Be gentle. He nodded, stepping into the humble house. The scent of cornbread lingered in the air, mingling with lemon polish and old wood. Out back, Loretta was sitting in a white rocking chair, slowly knitting something crimson. Her hands moved in steady rhythm, but her eyes were on the treetops. She didn't look up as he approached. Thomas stood behind her for a moment, unsure how to begin. I was hoping you'd still be here, he said finally. Loretta didn't stop knitting. I had nowhere else to go, she replied. Not after what happened. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired, like something deep inside her had gone quiet. Thomas stepped closer. Loretta, I'm sorry. Still, she didn't look at him. I should have spoken up sooner, he continued. I should have defended you the first time Vanessa disrespected you. Hell, I shouldn't have let her set foot in that house without understanding what you mean to it, what you mean to me. She stopped knitting, setting the yarn in her lap. You didn't just fail me, Thomas. You made me invisible in the house I helped raise. Her words cut deep. Thomas swallowed, his voice catching. You were never invisible to me. Loretta turned then, slowly, eyes filled with a lifetime of grace and pain. But you didn't stop her. You let her laugh at me. You let her move me like I was furniture. I let my silence speak louder than anything I could have said, he admitted. And that was wrong. She nodded once, slowly. You've grown into a fine man, Thomas. But even good men lose their way. He stepped forward, kneeling beside her chair like he used to as a child when he'd scraped his knee or been scolded at school. I came to ask you to come home, he said softly. Not as staff, as family, as someone who belongs there more than anyone. She studied him in silence. The wind rustled the trees behind her, lifting the edge of her shawl. I'm not sure I can come back, she said finally. Not unless something truly changes. Thomas nodded. Then I'll prove it to you. However long it takes. I'll fix it, Loretta. I swear to you. A long pause. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his. We'll see, she whispered. The sun was just beginning to set when the Ellington estate came back into view. Bathed in warm gold, the old bricks glowing like embers. This time, the car that pulled into the circular driveway didn't belong to Vanessa. It was Thomas, and in the passenger seat, Loretta sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, a soft silk scarf tied around her shoulders. She didn't speak as they approached the front steps, but her eyes scanned the familiar facade. The house looked the same, but everything had changed. Thomas stepped out first and walked around to open her door. No servants, no fanfare, just him, holding out his hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Inside, the staff stood waiting, not out of obligation, but because word had spread. And when Loretta stepped through the front door, every head bowed slightly. She was home. But there was one face missing. Vanessa's closet had been cleared. Her bags were already gone. And so was the coldness that had crept into the corners of the home. In its place was something else. Healing. Thomas had done more than just apologize. He called a family meeting, publicly acknowledging his failure and Loretta's immeasurable role in their lives. He'd rewritten her title in every family document, from head housekeeper to matriarch emeritus, and the staff quarters, untouched, preserved. Later that evening, Loretta stood at the top of the staircase, overlooking the grand hall, now quiet. She looked down at Thomas, who stood with Aunt Eleanor and Calvin by the fireplace. Her voice was calm but filled the room. I didn't come back for comfort. I came back because you remembered who you are. Thomas looked up at her, his voice steady. I remembered because of who you are. The camera pans out as Loretta slowly descends the stairs, her steps sure and full of grace. The past hadn't been erased, but honored. And in that home built on tradition, one woman's dignity had been restored not through apology alone, but through action, because love without respect is hollow, and redemption, when rooted in truth, can bring even the deepest wounds back into the light. Fade to black.